The next story is a story about the power of a story. In the corner of my parents' living room, leaning into the corner, was an oar. This was an old oar and had been hand carved from eastern red cedar. And the story was that this belonged to my great-great-grandfather Elijah, who lived in West Islip, Long Island, New York, and who was a member of the United States Life-Saving Service. And one of the things, there are three criteria, three conditions that have to be met if you're going to be a member of the United States Life-Saving Service. Condition number one is you have to live someplace where sailors are in peril, where boats are likely to run aground, where people are likely to need saving. Condition number two is that you've got to be willing to row out to sea in a rowboat with somewhere between 3 and 7 other people to save those people. You've got to go out in horrible, terrible, mean, vicious weather. You've got to be willing to go out and risk your life to save theirs. And condition number 3 is you had to bring your own oar. So great-great-granddaddy Elijah hand-carved his own oar from the heartwood of a Virginia cedar, and that stood in the corner of my parents' house. Well, now, when I got back from Uncle Lanny's farm, I was a very good student. So I did a wonderful job in high school. I got all A's and was in the Beta Club and the National Honor Society and the debate team, blah, blah, blah. And then I graduated, and when I went to the University of Tennessee, my intention was to major in physics and philosophy, a double major. And almost as soon as I got there, I picked up 4 new majors. Four brand new majors. I was majoring in the peace movement, and I was majoring in the free speech movement, and I was majoring in the civil rights movement, and I was majoring in smoking dope. And somehow physics and philosophy kind of got short shift there, you know. They didn't do all that well. And after a couple of years, it became apparent that my student deferment was about to evaporate, and I was about to go to Vietnam, a war in which I did not believe. So I made up my mind, and I went to Nashville, got on the bus, went to Nashville, and told my parents that I was moving to Toronto, where I was going to be a political refugee, and that in all likelihood they would never see me again. My dad didn't say a word. He sat in the corner with his teeth clamped down on his pipe and just glared at me. My mother said, "Well, good." She said, "I'll drive you to the bus station and buy your ticket." I don't think my sisters were in the room. Y'all weren't in the room, were you? But to my astonishment, I had not expected this. My grandmother was in the room. My father's mother was in the room, and she burst into tears, and she was crying so hard that she couldn't hold her head up, and her shoulders were shaking. She was sobbing, and right behind her in the corner was my great-great-grandfather Elijah's oar. So the next day, instead of getting on the bus to Toronto, I went to the recruiter and joined the Coast Guard. And figured I would spend the Vietnam War saving lives if I could. Well, I went to boot camp, and the very first day in boot camp, the company commander walks in and says, "At the end hut." We really had no idea what a tin hut meant, but we kind of knew. And then he said, "Everybody taller than 6 feet, 2 steps forward, hut." I took my 2 steps forward. And that is how I volunteered to be in the Coast Guard Honor Guard. And what they teach you in Honor Guard is to spin rifles and twirl them around and march with them and so on. And it turned out that I was kind of uncoordinated. And I didn't do that very well. And our instructor was a guy named Seaman Day. And Seaman Day had a terrible lisp. And one day I was messing things up especially badly. And Seaman Day got in my face and he said, "Seaman recruit, fall. Are you trying to piss me off?" And I swear to you, I did not think about this for one split second. It just came out. It just popped out. I had no control. I said, "Thur, no thur, Seaman Day, thur." At which point I spent a week in disciplinary company. Well, after I got out of disciplinary company, I went on in the Coast Guard and went on in the Honor Guard, and there's another story in there somewhere, but we'll not tell it tonight. And I eventually graduated from boot camp, and I got my assignment. My assignment was to go to the small boat search and rescue station in Galveston, Texas. And what a sweet assignment it was. I mean, this base was like a resort. Grass, neatly trimmed and mowed. I know because I mowed it. Beautiful oleander shrubs in bloom. Oh, it's just nice. And the way duty worked is I'd have 2 days on and 1 day off. And of the 2 days that were on, the first 24 hours I was on call to go out and rescue people if they needed rescuing. And for the second 8 hours or so, I was doing the most standard Coast Guard things: chip paint, and cleanup. And then the third day was off. Well, this was great duty. This was fabulous duty. And we would go out, we'd get a call, and we would go out, and there'd be some bozo fisherman out there who couldn't get his boat started. And we'd tow him in. Or there'd be somebody got lost, and we'd go out and find them and help them in. It wasn't exciting, it was just pleasant. The boat we used was something called a 30 boat. And it is a miracle boat. It's 30 feet long, steel hull, and in the very bow there's this little bitty cubby cabin that somebody can get in there if they're desperate. And then right behind the cubby cabin is an equipment locker, which is full of stuff. And then right behind that is the cockpit, which we call the pulpit. And that's the helm, and that's where the coxswain sits. And he's got a big windshield in front of him and a big screen behind him of a chain link fence, so if anything comes flying his way, it won't hit him. And that's where the throttle and the wheel and all the radios and sonars and radars and all that stuff is. And behind that, almost the entire rest of that boat is taken up with a 12-cylinder Detroit diesel engine. And right behind the Detroit diesel engine, there is a space about this big. And up through the floor, up through the deck, bolted to the keel, there's an iron cross. Iron comes up through the deck and cross at the top, and we call that the crucifix. And when you're towing somebody in, you put the line to the crucifix and tow them in. There were 3 people who served on this boat. There was an engineman, and the engineman was 95% of the time the world's most useless human being, because he had no duties at all unless the engine quit working. And that Detroit diesel never quit working. And then there was the coxswain, and he steered the boat and gave the orders, and when we pulled away, when we were 6 inches from the dock, he was God. You could not challenge him. His word was absolute and final. And then, according to the manual, the 3rd member of the crew is the able-bodied seaman. Now, in all the years that I was in the Coast Guard, I never heard this person called an able-bodied seaman, except in the manual. Everybody referred to this person as the deck ape. And I was the deck ape. Well, we'd go out and pull people in. It was kind of fun. Beautiful weather. The Gulf of Mexico is like a lake. The only bad thing was occasionally we'd have to go out and get a floater, and a floater's a dead body. And the good news is most of the time we'd look, but we couldn't find them because they're hard to find. And the bad news is if we ever did find one, it was my job to get it in the boat and put it in the body bag. And the longer it had been in the water, the nastier that job was. So I kind of hated to go out after floaters, but that didn't happen too often, and it was kind of a relatively small downside. And so one day, we got word that Hurricane Fern was coming straight toward Galveston. And Hurricane Fern was predicted to be a pretty strong storm. And so they evacuated the Galveston station. And they sent all the boats and all the crew and all the mess hall people and everybody, all the officers, up the Houston Ship Channel to hide out in Houston until the storm went by. But being the Coast Guard, they needed to leave one boat behind just in case. Guess whose boat got left behind? My boat. Now, we had issued a mandatory small craft emergency warning. Not advisory, and definitely mandatory. This was intended to prevent anybody from going out and to give them the message that if they went out, we weren't necessarily coming after them. But being the Coast Guard, we would have if we had to. And as it turned out, we had to. We're sitting there in the ready room, and the wind is howling outside, and the iron shutters are banging on the windows, and we can hear the sea crashing down by the docks. And we're playing pinochle and cribbage and reading dirty magazines for the 15th time and drinking strong Coast Guard coffee and talking, and the radio came alive. And we had to go out. There was a shrimper that had gone out hoping to catch a lot of shrimp right before the hurricane, because when the hurricane's coming, the barometric pressure drops to nothing. The shrimp all rise to the surface and run along the surface, and that is the very, very best time to catch shrimp if you want to catch shrimp. So they're out there, and they've got their booms down, and they're swept up completely full of shrimp, and all their mechanics died. The engine wouldn't start, no battery, nothing. And when the hurricane come, they're out there wallowing around like this in the waves, no control, firing off flares. Well, the people at the Buccaneer oil rig saw the flare and called us, and sure enough, we went out. The engineman, being an engineman, went to the cubby cabin, got in there, and shut the door. The coxswain sat down in the high seat at the helm, and strapped himself in, shoulder strap, and seat, double shoulder strap and seat strap, and out we went. My position, my station, was in the stern, where I was lashed to the crucifix, facing aft. So I got this iron bar right here. And the waves were horrendous. And the rain and the sea spray were so dense that it was hard to breathe. And I'm just back there whipping around like a scarecrow in a storm. And it was horrible, 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 horrible. And we spent 10 hours looking for that boat, with me lashed to the crucible. And then we found the damn thing. And the coxswain is backing and filling and backing and filling and backing and filling. He's bringing the stern of our boat up to the bow of their boat so I can throw over a throwing line with my monkey's fist. Now I need to stop and tell you about a monkey's fist. This is a fancy knot they teach you to tie in boot camp. And it's used to throw a throwing line. So you bend, which is sailor talk for tie, you bend the throwing line to this and then to the eye splice, and then you throw the monkey's fist over the other boat. And for this to work, you put a chunk of lead, a big, big steel ball bearing or a good sized chunk of lead in the middle so you can get some heft. Well, as it happened, about 3 weeks earlier, somebody had thrown a monkey's fist in a demonstration and hit an officer in the head and knocked him out. And so the admiral of the Coast Guard had decreed that henceforth monkey's fist would have a hunk of kapok on board, which is what they used to stuff life jackets with. Well, from that point forward, every deck ape had 2 monkey's fists. The real one with a nice hunk of lead in it so you could throw it, and the one for inspections, which had a little wad of kapok in the middle. So we get up close to the stern, our stern up to the bow of this boat. We're working our way upwind to him. And I grabbed my monkey's fist, and I said, oh, hell. I had my inspection monkey's fist, and not my good one. Well, I didn't know what else to do but to give it the old college try. So I grabbed it and went, hurrah! And so I'm reeling it in, and the coxswain is backing and filling, trying to get back into position. And I gave it another throw, went, hurrah! And threw my monkey's fist, and it went, whew. And I didn't know what to do. Well, I looked at the coxswain, and he was providing helpful instructions. I couldn't hear a word that he said, but I could tell they were helpful. It was like, so I thought, I'm just going to die here. And then I looked, and here comes the engineman, doing the first actually useful thing I ever saw an engineman do. He's on his hands and knees crawling down the space between the engine and the gunnel, and he's got a big wrench. So he gave me that wrench, And I hauled off. I bent it to the end of the line and threw it over the shrimp boat, and it landed on the deck, and somebody dived on it, and communication was established. At that point, I sent over a carbide fire axe capable of cutting through steel, and a little black slate on which I had written, "Cut off your booms." And at that point, the captain of the shrimp boat said exactly the same thing that the coxswain had been saying to me a few minutes ago. And so I took the throwing line and I held it up like this. I took my clasp knife and I held it like that. So he took the steel fire axe and he cut his booms off, and they sank to the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. That was thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars worth of equipment and shrimp. But we got a towing hawser over to him. Now you take the throwing line and you pull over the towing hawser, and the towing hawser is braided nylon. It's about that thick. And he gets it to his end of the boat. The captain of the shrimp boat gets it on his end, and he throws a double clove hitch around his bow post. And then I throw a couple of clove hitches or crucible hitches on my end. At which point we're paying out line, and there's about maybe 100, 150 feet of line between me and the shrimp boat. And the towing hawser is under my left arm, between my wrist and my ribs, coming right out there. Well, my job was to keep an eye on the shrimp boat and to keep an eye on the towing hawser and make sure that nothing was coming loose and make sure nobody was misbehaving. And the ride in was easy, because with the shrimp boat like a sea anchor, we were very steady. And because we were no longer running a search grid, the coxswain could choose his course so that he minimized the amount of damage that the waves were doing. And the hurricane had kind of passed by that point, and it was kind of wonderful. I thought, man, this adventure is over. But it wasn't. Galveston Bay the exit from Galveston Bay out to the Gulf of Mexico is 2-mile-long stone jetties, parallel. And the wind had been blowing up those jetties, up that channel, for the second half of the hurricane. And there were 60-foot rollers rolling in. And we had no option but to ride them. So more than half the time, I couldn't see the shrimp boat. All I could see was the hawser disappearing into the face of the wave. And then we'd reached the bottom, and about the time we reached the bottom, that shrimp boat had come over the top and come screaming down the face of that wave like a locomotive, and the coxswain is giving it everything he's got to get out of the trough before we're rammed by the shrimp boat. And then we chug up to the top of the next wave, and when we reached the top, that hawser snapped tight and screamed, "Whee!" And in boot camp, they showed us a film of what happened when a hawser like that snaps. If it breaks in the middle, it kills everybody on both boats. If it breaks on that end, it kills everybody on this boat. If it breaks on this end, it kills everybody on that boat. It sweeps the decks. So I am living in fear of this hawser, which is under my left armpit. But we got back to Galveston Bay okay. we got back okay. And we tied both boats up to the dock. And the captain of that shrimp boat came screaming at me. He was going to sue me for everything I was worth, which was not very much. Everything I had was in the locker. And he was going to sue the coxswain, and he was going to sue the commandant of the base, and then he was going to sue the admiral of the Coast Guard. And all the time he's screaming at me about all the people he's going to sue. The coxswain was inspecting his boat and writing a stack of tickets for all of the safety violations, some of which contributed to him being out there in the middle of the storm. And of course, he also got a ticket for going out during a mandatory emergency small craft warning. So he wasn't very happy. But he was alive. And everybody on his crew was alive. And I was alive, and everybody on my crew was alive, and somehow it turned out okay. And I spent another while at Galveston, and I spent some more time in the Coast Guard. I went and did a little duty in Nashville, Tennessee, and did a little duty in St. Louis on the Mississippi River, which is pretty exciting. And eventually I got out of the Coast Guard and went back to college and turned in several semesters in a row of straight A's, and graduated and started my professional career. So I'm kind of proud of the time I spent in the Coast Guard. I'm kind of proud of saving some people's lives and doing some good. And I'm proud of the Coast Guard because of all the fine work they do. But you know what? My great-great-grandfather Elijah, who was in the United States Life-Saving Service, saved one more life. Mine. Thanks.